Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Mustafa Ozbilgin, who will discuss his book with Diana Woodward, Banking and Gender, Sex Equality in the Financial Services Sector in Britain and Turkey. Welcome to Rip Rap, Mustafa.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm very pleased to be in Michigan. I would like to thank you and also my sponsors, Institute for Research for Women and Gender, as well as the Department of Women's Studies at University of Michigan.
Well, I was fascinated with this book because you look at the combined issues of banking and gender. How did this fascinating project develop?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I have undertaken this study in Britain and Turkey, comparing and contrasting several financial service organizations in terms of their sex equality practice at different levels.
Well, that's what made it so interesting. It was England and Turkey, which is not something I would normally think of in terms of a combined project.
Yes, it's very interesting because, as you say, you wouldn't immediately think of comparing Britain and Turkey. Although the initial reasons for conducting the study were convenience, later it came out with very pertinent answers, our study. Because Turkey is a country, a very important country to study women's position in society. It's a paradoxical country. At the low levels, low segments of society, particularly for undereducated women, sex discrimination is a fact of life. Because unskilled and lowly skilled work is severely sex segregated. However, if you look at professional forms of employment, female doctors, female engineers, and female banking professionals in this case, and female academics experience less discrimination than their Western and North American counterparts. So this is a very contradictory story. There is a very contradictory story to tell, paradoxical case to tell about Turkey. Whereas Britain has been the champion of legal approach to equality of opportunity since 1970s. Several pieces of legislation has been passed to prevent different forms of discrimination. Whereas in Turkey, there was not a legal route to equality, but a more ideological route, dating back to 1920s, when the revolution from Ottoman Empire to Turkish Republic has taken place, when women's issues, particularly women's equality and participation in professional employment was considered a main part of modernization and nationalization project in Turkey.
Well, what I found fascinating is that there were some similarities as well as differences. One of the big differences is that, as you point out in the book, that there's 3 centuries that Britain has had to develop its, structure, and Turkey's had, about a century? But there's been a lot happening in that century, and I think it'd be helpful for you to give some of that background so we understand the context.
Okay, in terms of the financial services sector in Britain, it has a history of 3 centuries, as you have rightly pointed out. And this history has been marked with very slow transformational change. There were not many breaks with tradition in this history. Whereas in Turkey, if you look at the development of the financial services sector in the Ottoman Empire, it was established by the minority groups, particularly Christians and Jews, who had developed the Galata banking system in Istanbul, and the heritage of that was completely broken when the Turkish Republic was established. This meant that by 1920s, the financial services sector was nationalized, and British and French institutions had to withdraw from Turkey, and also the minority ethnic groups which were controlling the financial services sector had to abandon this control. Therefore, a new financial services sector was established in 1920s. This meant that the Turkish financial services sector could have a break with its tradition unlike its British counterpart. This also meant that new logics could be brought into financial services sector. The reforms that Mustafa Kemal, the founding father of the Turkish Republic, has brought about had implications, huge implications for equality in Turkey. It placed firmly the agenda for equality for women in its republican as well as secular agenda. It was women's position in society was an important indicator of the modernization and westernization of Turkey. They were the two key ideals driving Mustafa Kemal's principles of reformation in Turkey. Therefore, in 1920s there was this big break with tradition, and then great numbers of women and men entered this newly formed sector. This meant that they didn't have to carry a baggage of the past, the legacy of the past with its different forms of discrimination. Whereas in Britain, for 300 years, banking sector, financial services sector experienced little change. There was change, however, in after 1940s with the inclusion of women in the sector. However, this inclusion did not bring about fundamental changes to the structure of the organization in the country. This meant that still the long working hours continued. This meant that organizations still provided little provision for work-life balance, which essentially and effectively excluded women from privileged posts. Women were able to enter the banking profession in great numbers. If you look at the proportion of women workers in Britain in the financial services sector, they exceed the number of male workers in the sector. However, if you look at their positioning in the hierarchy, you will see that there is a severe sex segregation in vertical organization within the sector. Only very few senior executives in the sector are women still today.
Well, that's what I thought was interesting. You had both the vertical and horizontal dimensions to what you're doing, and that you use this, the gender dimensions of issues like belonging and otherness of the individual worker in relation to employment norms, occupational closure, organizational politics, as a way of kind of sorting out what was going on. And like you were saying, I think it was also interesting that in Britain there were still, old ways that had not been changed.
Yes, there are old ways in Britain, but there are also old ways in Turkey that came into play once the sector established itself. As you've noted, we have this three-pronged approach to studying equality in our book. The first one is belonging and otherness. In order to understand individual feeling of belonging and otherness and how this may be gendered in professional lives, we have looked at the ideal category of worker, ideal worker category. So we have tried to identify who makes a good worker in each organization. And what we have found was very interesting indeed. In order to belong to the ideal worker category, you are more likely to be a man. Men belonged to the ideal worker category more frequently than women because of their ability to dissociate themselves from domestic responsibilities,
Right.
and because of their also ability, by the nature of this, same thing, ability to remain at work and show face time in organizational life, and also their really skilled approach to networking, which yielded very positive results for them. For example, we have identified that networks based on cricket, football, golf, all these kind of very male-dominated forms of sport, which are supported by financial service sector organizations with institutional funds, were very instrumental in introducing young new entrants to senior executives, allowing them a kind of recognition that women in the same position will not benefit from. So these internal networks, when they overlap with the objective structures of the organization, operate as glass elevators rather than glass ceilings for men, lifting them up gently through the organizational hierarchies. A successful sportsman means a lot for many financial service sector organizations today when they are competing against others.
But the point that you're making, and Diana's making, is that these are gendered privileges.
Certainly, and this gendering process in terms of who belongs to the ideal worker category has very concrete material consequences for women and men in the sector. But we have also looked at this notion of horizontal and vertical sex segregation. It is possible to identify that women and men work in occupy different specialist categories in the sector. You will find more women, for example, in human resource management departments as junior staff, and more men in financial accounting. That is the typical case in the UK. And also in Turkey, we see similar logics in the financial services sector. So this is horizontal sex segregation, where women and men occupy different specialist posts. However, there is also a vertical sex segregation, where women and men are differently represented at levels of hierarchy. And we see that there is men are disproportionately highly represented in high-ranking posts in the sector, whereas women are better represented at the lower levels of the organization. And what was really interesting about how this came about was the collective and individual strategies that women and men employed in seeking to exclude one another from these privileged posts, or their strategies of usurpation. When we talk about these groups, I make it a very conscious kind of process. It's not necessarily a conscious process when we consider the indirect forms of discrimination, for example, long working hours. Well, if the management elite do not recognize this or work-life balance issues as pertinent for women's employment or women's careers in management, then of course this will serve as a strategy to exclude them from managerial posts.
Well, and you point out in terms of sexual harassment, there was a story in some of the chapters about a woman and a man, and they had a relationship. The man proposed something the woman did not anticipate, wanting to become intimate. When she complained about that, she was penalized, but he was not. So she really lost out on that.
Yes, although many institutions now harassment policies and strategies to combat sexual harassment of any kind, we see that in practice sexual harassment is still evident. Unfortunately, many women do not find the courage, and they also perceive that there are still difficulties in complaining about their senior colleagues harassing them. And that was a very sad case indeed, that the manager was promoted after the complaint of sexual harassment. But nevertheless, they were able to change the position, change the department of the female participant, so that she did no longer have to work with the same manager. But it is a very sad thing that today, even when I talk to workers in the financial services sector, there continues the very overt forms of sexual harassment.
The sexual harassment, I thought, was a way of filtering out, keeping women in their place.
Also a taboo subject, and considering that I have conducted the interviews and I'm a man, and talking to women about sexual harassment is not very easy, neither for me nor for the women in question, because it requires skills of sensitivity, empathy, and you are uncovering something which is very unpleasant, stirring negative memories.
Women in both Britain and Turkey encounter what you called exclusionary strategies, and there's also the notion that women are primarily responsible for duties such as domestic work and childcare. Regardless of where they are in the management structure, there's that implicit demands being made on them.
Domestic work still is considered a kind of female role, and that has negative consequences on women's careers. However, there were several couples, dual career couples, that were sharing responsibilities, and they have commented along those lines. So there was change, but the speed of change was very slow. And there was also one couple where man took voluntary redundancy in order to look after the children, because his partner was enjoying a very successful career in the financial services sector. So the alternative models of family were there, but they were not commonplace. And also, recently, new provisions such as paternity leave were introduced.
One of the things that we should talk about a little bit, at least, is you have a very carefully worked out theoretical framework.
Mainstream theoretical frameworks are, particularly in the field of economics and business studies, are concerned with productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, and worker motivation. And gender is often an afterthought in these mainstream works. Our aim was to survey mainstream literature, but place gender at the core of all these productivity, effectiveness concerns, as well as the overall operation of the financial services sector in terms of employment relations. What I have done in terms of structuring the work was to identify three levels. At the first level, there was the belonging and otherness that one individual worker may feel, having an understanding, after acquiring an understanding of the ideal worker category in the workplace. And this belonging and otherness feeling may be gendered. So we have looked at this process as a theoretical framework. The second theoretical framework that we have seen was the different forms of sex discrimination that may be experienced at the organizational level. For this purpose, we have looked at theories of vertical and horizontal sex segregation, the glass ceiling phenomena, and the occupational closure theory developed by Ann Witz. It was very negatively driven, and I thought, is there nothing positive happening here? So I started looking into the literature on different political ideologies which aspire to achieve equality in the workplace. We have looked at liberal, radical, and transformational ideologies that were introduced by Cynthia Coburn, and noted that there was evidence of liberal ideology, liberal perspective in the financial services sector in Britain. Whereas in Turkey there was no state policy, explicit policy to eradicate inequalities. Turkey is a country which is in the process of applying to become a member of European Union, and this will involve some legal changes. Turkey has to make legal changes to introduce equality legislation soon. But if you look at the opportunities that were provided to Turkish women, you see that their proportion in managerial categories was not less than their counterparts in the UK. And the push for equality in Turkey came from an ideological basis of modernization and westernization. So the final part of the project looked at what are those strategies employed to manage diversity and equality in the sector. What we have formulated was to look at financial service sector employees in both countries. In Turkey, my access was relatively easy, and I was able to access 3 companies. I was able to get into those organizations and do questionnaires and interview a whole range of workers in Turkey. And this meant that I was able to talk to some people from trade unions, people who are in managerial positions. The perspective I gained from the Turkish case was really far-reaching. However, in Britain I had tremendous difficulties in getting into financial service organizations. Yes. I wrote to about over 20 organizations, and I had rejections from half of them. Half of them wouldn't respond, and 2 of them continued negotiations for 6 months and then withdrew. But I can understand why this was. Britain was becoming a very litigious society at that moment in time, and some of the litigations, cases that leaked out to press caused concern in the financial services sector. They didn't want to allow access on this sensitive subject. Therefore, I felt very powerless. I was even thinking of doing a study on Turkey on its own. However, several people suggested that I should employ different strategies for this. So I started using a snowballing technique. I contacted everyone I know that has a connection to a financial service organization, and I was able to gain then to a company whose human resource manager was an old student of a professor I met at the same university, at University of Bristol, and this meant that I was able to gain access to that organization. And then when I was doing my interviews, several people had colleagues working in other institutions, and they recommended that I have interviews with them, and so I was finally able to gain kind of a wide perspective conducting studies in 5 financial institutions.
See, that's just something that's always fascinated me. Studies in the academy are not dull and boring and dusty. They touch on the very politics and powers and conflicts, the very nodes of action and intersection in society and cultures. And so this isn't a dull book by any means. This is really a book that deals with some very potent intersections of power and interpretation of it.
What I also observed in conducting these studies was that you have to approach the cultural context. You have to be very sensitive to the cultural context in which the study takes place. For example, in Turkey, I had to have so many cups of tea in a day in order to gain access. I think I had over 10 cups of tea to sit down with executive managers. And whereas in British context, time was structured, time was extremely valuable. There is much written documentation, and you have to submit written proposals, and there are ethical protocols, and the processes are very complex and bureaucratic.
A reoccurring concern in your book is the way male domination of power, authority, and wealth has continued in the financial services sector of both countries.
Yes, gender pay gap in Britain is still wide. I think it stands something like women earning about 80% of their male colleagues still today. And there has been some improvement recently. The same case applies to Turkish context. The main reason for this gap is the lack of transparency in Britain. Many organizations, in terms of the organizations that I have studied, all of them, ask explicitly to their workers that they should not disclose their salary and wage information. And this works as a mechanism to conceal very overt forms of sex discrimination. So even if the organizations today are kind of committing themselves to equality in Britain, there is still evidence of continuation of differential payment. Some of it is because of the value, lower value women assign to themselves. But there is also this culture that's established in the financial world that you should not complain. They tend to recruit people who are very positive about life and acritical, essentially. Even if they were receiving £8,000 less than their immediate male colleagues, they were not complaining about the situation. And they were saying, well, this is the fact of life and I know how to live with it, in one of the interviews.
I was also interested in the, I guess, configuration of positions. In Turkey, there was a considerable, in one of those tables you showed how there was a non-managerial positions that women would be much more predominant, if not exclusive in. And they were quite happy to get those because they couldn't get into the upper regions of the administrative managerial positions.
In Turkey, there are several issues. In terms of unskilled work, feminist movement has not paid much attention to it. Therefore, most of the unskilled work, particularly if it means to go out and mix with, if it means to provide service, goes to men, where there was no interaction with the external world. They employed great numbers of women, and their careers were constrained to that kind of position, without any hope of career progress. I think many male managers that I interviewed associated that with the expectation that lowly skilled women will get married and leave their jobs.
Well, Mustafa, this has been an interesting discussion, and I was really fascinated with this cross-cultural research project, and it's big and it's evocative, and it really raises some substantial questions about the scope of progress toward sex equality and employment. I think not only in Britain and Turkey, but elsewhere. How do you do it? How do you define it? What are the theories you bring to apply on it? People will find it a good read. Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.